This story is based on real letters, diaries, and first-person accounts from Black American soldiers stationed in England during World War II. The boy learned early not to look white men in the eye. His grandmother taught him this in Alabama in the summer when he was 7, after he had asked a shopkeeper where the crackers were kept and received a slap across the mouth for his directness. She pulled him outside by the arm, her grip tight enough to leave marks, and crouched before him in the dust behind the store where no one could see them. "You don't ask," she said. "You wait. You keep your eyes down, and you wait until they tell you what you need to know." He remembered the heat of that afternoon, the way the air seemed to press against his skin, the taste of copper in his mouth. He remembered nodding, though he did not fully understand. Understanding came later in increments, through accumulated experience rather than explanation. By the time he was 12, he knew which sidewalks to cross before reaching them, which doors never to approach, which words never to speak, regardless of their truth. He learned to make himself smaller in the presence of certain people, to calculate the weight of his footsteps, to calibrate the tone of his voice until deference became a language he spoke more fluently than English. These were not lessons anyone sat him down to teach. They accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer, until the whole architecture of his daily life rested upon them. The town where he grew up had 2 water fountains, 2 entrances to the movie theater, 2 separate worlds that occupied the same physical space, but never touched. He drank from the fountain marked for colored people without thinking about it, the way one learns to favor the right hand or to blink against sudden light. It was simply the order of things, as fixed and immutable as the position of stars. When he was 17, a white man called him boy in front of the post office, and he answered, "Yes, sir," with such practiced smoothness that his own father, standing beside him, said nothing at all. They walked home in silence. His father's hands, calloused from decades of work in the sawmill, hung loose at his sides. That evening, after supper, his father sat on the porch steps and stared at the road for a long time. The boy wanted to say something, wanted to explain that he had only been doing what was necessary, what they both knew was required for survival. But his father never turned around, and the boy never found the words. He enlisted in 1942, 2 months after Pearl Harbor, at a recruitment office in Montgomery, where a bored sergeant looked him over and pointed to a separate line. The white recruits went through processing quickly. He waited for 3 hours standing against a wall before anyone spoke to him. When they finally called his name, the medical examination was cursory, the paperwork handled with visible distaste, as though the very act of recording his information was an imposition. He had imagined that the uniform would change something, that wearing the same clothes, carrying the same rifle, serving the same flag, might create some margin of equality, some recognition of shared purpose. The first night at the training camp in Georgia, he learned otherwise. The colored troops were housed in separate barracks at the far edge of the compound near the latrines and the incinerator. They ate in shifts after the white soldiers had finished. They trained on different days, used different facilities, marched in formations that never intersected with those of their white counterparts. An officer explained the arrangement during orientation, his voice neither hostile nor apologetic, merely factual as one might describe the weather. "This is how we maintain discipline," he said. "This is how we keep order." No one asked questions. The colored recruits stood at attention, their faces carefully blank, absorbing this information the way they had absorbed so many previous lessons about their place in the world. He became part of the 1696th Engineer Combat Battalion, a unit assigned to construction work, road building, and supply operations. They would not see combat, he was told. Their role was to support those who did. He carried timber, drove trucks, laid gravel in muddy fields that transformed into airstrips. The work was hard and mindless. He did it without complaint. In the spring of 1944, his unit shipped out from New York Harbor aboard a transport vessel crowded with thousands of men. The colored troops were assigned to the lowest decks, where the air was thick and stale, and the smell of diesel fuel mixed with vomit and sweat. He spent the crossing in near darkness, listening to the groan of metal and the endless sound of engines, wondering what waited for him across the ocean. England appeared through fog on a cold morning in April. He saw green fields, stone walls, hedgerows tangled and ancient. The countryside looked smaller than America, more contained, as though everything had been arranged with careful attention to proportion and use. They disembarked at Liverpool and travelled south by train. The landscape passing in fragments through dirty windows, villages with names he could not pronounce, churches with square towers, farms pressed close against the railway line. His unit was stationed near a town in Wiltshire, a place of narrow streets and old buildings that seemed to lean against one another for support. The base itself was a sprawling collection of nissen huts and muddy pathways, supply depots and motor pools, everything temporary and improvised. The coloured troops were billeted separately as they had been in Georgia. The officers made this clear from the first day. There would be no mixing, no confusion about expectations. But the town itself operated under different rules. The first time he walked into the village on a Saturday afternoon pass, he expected the usual arrangement: separate entrances, separate seating, invisible lines he would be expected to recognize and respect. Instead, he found ordinary civilians going about ordinary business with no apparent awareness of the distinctions that governed his entire life. Children played in the street without regard for who was watching. Women queued at shops and spoke to one another regardless of age or station. The pubs, he noticed, had no signs indicating separate facilities, no markers dividing space by race. He entered a small shop to buy cigarettes, and the woman behind the counter looked at him directly, met his eyes, and asked what he needed. The question was so plain, so devoid of calculation or subtext, that he hesitated before answering. When he handed her the money, she counted out his change into his palm without flinching, without the exaggerated care white shopkeepers in Alabama used to avoid touching his skin. She thanked him and wished him a good afternoon. He stood outside the shop for several minutes afterward, trying to understand what had just happened. Over the following weeks, he observed that this was not an isolated incident. British civilians seemed genuinely indifferent to the colour of his skin in ways that felt almost incomprehensible. They greeted him on the street. They made room for him on crowded buses. They spoke to him in pubs and asked about America with genuine curiosity. Some were kind, some were curt, some ignored him entirely. But their treatment seemed to arise from individual temperament rather than collective enforcement of racial hierarchy. An elderly man in the village invited him to Sunday dinner simply because they had shared a park bench one afternoon and fallen into conversation about the weather. The man's wife served roast chicken and potatoes and asked him questions about his family with the same polite interest she might show to any guest. He ate slowly, half expecting some trick, some sudden revelation that this courtesy was conditional or false, but it never came. They simply treated him as a person who happened to be sitting at their table. This kindness was disorienting in ways he struggled to articulate. He had spent his entire life navigating a world where his race determined every interaction, where safety required constant vigilance and careful performance. In England, that script no longer applied. The British had their own hierarchies, their own snobberies and prejudices related to class and accent and region, but these operated independently of his skin colour. He was foreign, certainly, but not in the specific way he had always been foreign in his own country. The American military, however, brought its rules with it. Orders circulated among the troops regarding conduct in town. The language was carefully neutral, but the intent was clear. Coloured soldiers were encouraged to frequent certain establishments and discouraged from others. Officers suggested specific pubs where they might be more comfortable, by which they meant pubs the white troops would not patronize. The separation was not official policy. The British government had made clear it would not enforce American racial customs, but it was maintained through informal pressure, through strategic assignments, and carefully timed passes that ensured the two groups rarely overlapped in town. White American soldiers sometimes brought their expectations with them into British establishments. There were incidents, stories that circulated among the coloured troops, of white G's demanding that pub owners refuse service to coloured soldiers, of confrontations in dance halls, of British civilians being told they should not socialize with Negroes if they wished to maintain good relations with American forces. Some establishments dependent on American business quietly complied. Others did not. The Swan and Crown sat on a corner near the center of town, a Tudor building with dark timber beams and diamond-paned windows that had been there since the 17th century. It was neither the largest nor the most popular pub, but it had a reputation for decent beer and a landlord who ran a quiet house. The soldier had walked past it many times without entering, assuming it fell into the category of places he was meant to avoid. One evening in late June, after a long day of work laying mast and mat for a new airfield, he found himself with a few hours of liberty and no particular place to go. The other men in his unit had dispersed to their usual spots, but he felt restless and unwilling to return to the barracks. He walked through the village as the light faded, past the church and the greengrocer and the small bridge over the stream, until he found himself standing outside the Swan and Crown. Through the window he could see people inside, civilians mostly, a few soldiers in uniform scattered among them. The warm light and low hum of conversation seemed to promise something he had not felt in a long time, a sense of ordinary belonging, of being simply another person seeking respite at the end of a difficult day. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The conversation did not stop. No one turned to stare. He made his way to the bar, conscious of his movements, of the space he occupied, and waited. The landlord, a man in his 50s with thinning hair and a face that suggested long acquaintance with hard work, finished pulling a pint for another customer, and then looked at him with the same neutral courtesy he had shown everyone else. "What'll you have?" The soldier ordered a mild and paid for it when it arrived. He found a spot near the wall, away from the main crowd, and drank slowly. The beer was warm and slightly bitter, nothing like the cold lagers he had known back home, but it was good in its own way, comforting in its simplicity. He had been there perhaps 20 minutes when 3 white American soldiers entered. They were loud, already half drunk from somewhere else, their voices carrying across the room with the particular aggression that comes from youth, uncertainty, and the absence of consequence. They ordered drinks and stood at the bar talking among themselves in the exaggerated drawl that some southern whites adopted when they wanted to make clear the boundaries they carried with them. One of them noticed the soldier against the wall. He said something to his companions too quiet for anyone else to hear, and they laughed. The soldier kept his eyes on his drink, his posture carefully neutral, giving them no reason to approach, no provocation. But the white soldier came over anyway. He stood in front of the table, blocking the light, his expression caught between amusement and contempt. "You lost, boy." The soldier did not look up. "Nung. This ain't the kind of place for you. You understand? I'm just having a drink." The white soldier leaned closer, his voice dropping to something more dangerous than the initial mockery. "We don't drink with your kind. Not back home. Not here. Not anywhere. You need to leave." The room had gone quiet. The British civilians were watching now, their conversations suspended. The landlord stood behind the bar, his hand resting on the counter, his expression unreadable. The soldier felt the old familiar calculations running through his mind. He could leave. It would be easier to leave. He had left 1,000 other places under similar circumstances, had learned that survival often meant choosing the path of least resistance, swallowing pride in exchange for safety. But something in him resisted this time. He had paid for his drink. He had broken no rule except the unwritten one these men carried with them like a disease. "I'm staying," he said quietly. The white soldier reached for him, his hand closing around the collar of the uniform, preparing to haul him out bodily. But before he could pull, the landlord's voice cut through the tension. "Take your hand off him." The white soldier turned, his grip loosening slightly. "What?" I said. "Take your hand off him. He's done nothing wrong. I know what he is. He's a customer in my pub. Same as you. Same as anyone." The white soldier released his grip but did not step back. "You don't know what you're dealing with. Back home. This isn't back home," the landlord said. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was steel underneath. "This is England. And in England, in this pub, a man who pays for his drink is welcome to sit and drink it in peace." That's how we do things here. One of the other white soldiers called from the bar, his voice carrying a warning. You're making a mistake. Maybe so, the landlord said, but it's mine to make. The standoff held for several seconds. The white soldiers looked at one another, performing some silent negotiation about whether the confrontation was worth escalating. The soldier at the table remained still, his heart beating hard enough that he could feel it in his throat, knowing that whatever happened next would not be determined by him. Finally, the white soldier who had grabbed him stepped back. We don't need your charity, he said to the landlord. He turned to the soldier. You're lucky. Won't always be some limey to protect you. The three of them left, slamming the door behind them hard enough to rattle the windows. The normal sounds of the pub resumed slowly, conversations restarting in low tones, people returning to their drinks and their companionship. The landlord came out from behind the bar and walked over to the table. You all right? The soldier nodded, not trusting his voice. Another pint. Yes, thank you. The landlord brought it over himself, set it on the table, and then returned to his work without further comment. The soldier sat alone, holding the glass in both hands, feeling something shift inside him that he could not name. No one in his life had ever stood up for him like that. Not when it mattered, not when there was a cost. The white men in Alabama would have called the sheriff. The officers at the training camp would have ordered him to move. Even the sympathetic civilians he had met in England, for all their kindness, had never been tested, never been forced to choose between their courtesy and the possibility of real consequence. But this man, this ordinary pub owner, with his tired face and working-class accent, had made a choice. He had drawn a line and defended it, not out of friendship or obligation, but from some bedrock conviction about fairness and human dignity that required no justification beyond itself. The soldier understood that this moment was fragile. He understood that it existed within a specific set of circumstances that might never align again. The American military would not change its policies because one British landlord refused to enforce them. The white soldiers would not suddenly abandon their assumptions. He would return to the base, to the segregated barracks, and the separate facilities, and the whole apparatus of racial hierarchy that followed him everywhere. But for this one evening, in this one place, someone had treated him as though his presence mattered, as though his right to occupy space was as legitimate as anyone else's. That recognition, however temporary, however localized, had weight. It existed. It could not be taken back. Over the following weeks, he returned to the Swan and Crown several times. The landlord greeted him with the same quiet courtesy he showed everyone, never mentioning the incident, never seeking gratitude or acknowledgement. Sometimes other colored soldiers from his unit came with him, and they sat together in a corner and drank, and talked about small things, careful not to draw attention, but no longer hiding. The white American soldiers did not return, whether this was by choice or by some unofficial directive from their commanders. The soldier never learned. The British civilians in the pub treated him with the same casual indifference they had always shown, which felt more valuable than any explicit welcome might have. Once, on a warm evening in July, a British couple at the next table struck up a conversation. They were young, perhaps newly married, and they asked him about America with the kind of innocent curiosity that comes from never having experienced the particular cruelties of its racial order. He told them about Alabama, about the cotton fields and the long hot summers, about the food his grandmother made, and the church where he had been baptized. He did not tell them about the other things, the lessons his grandmother had taught him, the careful choreography of survival. He let them imagine America as they wished, and in their company, for those few minutes, he almost believed in that gentler version himself. The summer passed. His unit continued its work, building and hauling and supporting the vast machinery of war that moved through England on its way to France. He heard about D-Day from other soldiers, about the beaches and the casualties and the slow grinding advance across the continent. His own war remained one of labor and logistics, of mud and exhaustion, and the particular tedium of necessary work that earns no recognition. In August he received a letter from his father. It was brief, written in the careful handwriting of a man who had learned to read and right late in life. The crops were good this year. His younger brother had found work at the rail yard. His grandmother had died in her sleep peacefully with no warning. The funeral had been well attended. They missed him and prayed for his safe return. He read the letter sitting on his bunk in the Nissen hut, surrounded by the sounds of other men going about their evening routines. He felt the loss as a distant ache, complicated by the knowledge that he could not go home, could not stand at her grave, or sit with his family in the small house where she had raised him. The war had placed him on the other side of the ocean, in a country where strangers treated him with more basic decency than he had ever known in his own. He thought about his grandmother's lessons, about the rules she had taught him to keep him safe. He wondered what she would make of this place, of the pub owner who had defended him, of the British civilians who seemed genuinely unbothered by distinctions that had governed her entire existence. Would she have trusted it? Or would she have warned him that kindness from white people, even here, was always provisional, always subject to withdrawal? He did not know. He folded the letter and put it in the small box where he kept his few personal belongings. Autumn came, and with it the cold rain that turned the English countryside grey and sodden. The work continued. The war in Europe ground toward its conclusion with agonizing slowness. He heard rumors that his unit might be reassigned, sent to the Pacific Theater once Germany fell, but nothing was certain. He went to the Swan and Crown on a Tuesday evening in October, seeking shelter from the rain and the company of familiar faces. The pub was quieter than usual, just a handful of regulars and one other American soldier, a white man from a different unit who sat at the bar reading a newspaper. The landlord nodded when the soldier entered, already reaching for a glass. They did not speak, but there was an understanding between them now, built from months of small interactions, and the memory of that one defining moment. The soldier took his usual spot near the wall and drank his beer, and watched the rain streak the windows. The white soldier at the bar finished his drink and left. The British regulars talked quietly among themselves about rationing and the coming winter, and whether the war would truly end before another year passed. The soldier listened without joining in, content to be present without being noticed. When he finished his drink and prepared to leave, the landlord caught his eye and raised a hand in farewell. It was a small gesture, barely perceptible, but it carried the weight of recognition, of one person acknowledging another across the distance that separated them. The soldier walked back to the base through the rain, his coat pulled tight against the cold. He thought about going home, about returning to Alabama, where the same rules would apply, the same careful navigation of invisible boundaries. He thought about his grandmother's grave and his father's quiet resignation, and the whole architecture of segregation that waited for him with patient indifference. But he also thought about the pub owner, about the choice that man had made without hesitation, about the possibility that somewhere in the world, even if only briefly, dignity could be defended by ordinary people unwilling to compromise on basic decency. It was not enough to change his circumstances. It was not enough to protect him from what awaited him. But it was something, a small light in a long darkness, a moment when someone had looked at him and seen a person worthy of defense, worthy of the simple right to sit and drink in peace. He carried that moment with him through the remaining months of the war, through the eventual return to America, through the decades that followed. He never forgot the Swan and Crown, or the man who had refused to let him be driven out. In the years to come, when the weight of segregation bore down with particular force, when the old rules reasserted themselves with renewed vigor, he would remember that evening in Wiltshire, that quiet act of courage by a stranger who owed him nothing. It had not changed the world, but it had changed him in ways both subtle and profound, teaching him that dignity was not granted by those in power, but claimed by those who refused to surrender it, defended by those who recognized its value, even when doing so required standing against the expectations of their own. The rain continued to fall as he reached the barracks. Inside, the other men were playing cards, writing letters, preparing for sleep. He hung up his wet coat and sat on his bunk, feeling the warmth slowly return to his hands. Outside, The English countryside stretched dark and invisible beyond the windows, holding its secrets, keeping its own counsel about the small dramas that unfolded within its borders. Somewhere in the village, the lights of the Swan and Crown still burned, welcoming those who sought refuge from the cold and the rain. The landlord stood behind his bar, pulling pints for whoever asked, maintaining the small patch of ground he had claimed as his own, where the rules were simple and the welcome genuine. And for one black American soldier, far from home and closer to understanding what home might mean, that was enough.